So welcome to Becoming a Polyglot. I will say that this will also be given at KCDC and YAPC this year. So if you're going to go to one of those conferences and have something else that you are desperate to see also, I won't feel bad if you go to the other talk. So let's get started. I am Kirsten Hunter. I'm an API evangelist at Akamai, which is the best job ever. I've been working with REST APIs for a little over 10 years, so I had the advantage of becoming really enamored with a technology that was sort of in its nascent form and not really that well understood or used, and then spending 10 years becoming passionate about it and teaching people how to do it well. And I get to be an industry thought leader in what's the new black, so it works out really well for me. My website is princesspolymath.com. There's a sample code there. There's some musings that I have. There's also a link to all of my presentations in video form. And when I give a presentation, such as this one, I'm going to go ahead and make a narrative version as a blog post. I feel like looking at my slides is really not that helpful without my interpretive dance. So instead, I like to actually write a reasonably coherent blog post so that you can understand what it was I was talking about. I'm also working on a book called Irresistible APIs. It has just gone to production. It'll be ready at the end of the summer. And it is about creating APIs that developers will love. It's about the developer experience. And I will humbly recommend that anyone who's interested in creating APIs that are fantastic, have a great developer experience, and thus are successful, should at least read the first chapter of my book, which is free on Manning. Language-wise, I started out as a Perl programmer. I was a Perl programmer for 15 years. And then I sort of moved to Python, and I started using all of the other languages. As a developer advocate and API evangelist, I have had many cases where I'm trying to make sample code for people, and they feel intimidated by the code because it's not in the language that they understand. So the point of this talk is to help you to see that actually the other languages aren't that different. You can look at some Python code and port it to Perl if that's what you want. You can look at any kind of code, especially when it's something as simple as an API or something that's going to particular endpoints. So what's the problem I'm trying to solve? The problem I'm trying to solve is that we don't do good polyglot in the open source community. We have siloed communities. We have Pythonistas, we have Rubyists, we have Perl mongers, we have PHP developers, we have Nodists. And people tend to cluster around people who use the same language, and there's a lot of exclusivity between the communities. I feel like we would be a much stronger community if everyone just accepted that languages are a personal choice. They may be appropriate for a particular project, but what I have seen happen that made me really sad was somebody bagged on PHP, like you do, and there was another person sitting there who had solved a problem using PHP, and they didn't say anything. Like, they didn't participate in the conversation at all. And I want us to get better at having those conversations even between the languages that we use, especially interpreted languages, open source interpreted languages. They all tend to be very similar in terms of the way that people use them and the logic that's used in them. The idiomatic differences can be somewhat challenging, but it's worth it to at least buy yourself a level in each of the other languages so that when you're looking at example code, you're not out in the cold because they use Ruby and you're a Python person. So I had a situation, some of you are probably like, well, obviously you would look at the sample code and you would port it to your language and that would be easy. So I had a conversation with a customer in one of our forums, and the customer said, I need the traffic management sample code in Perl. And I said, well, there's an example in Python, and it hits 3 endpoints for HTTP. So you could port it to Perl. It wouldn't be very hard. And she's like, but I can't use Python. I can only use Perl. And I was like, but what I'm saying is you can look at the code and understand what it's doing and then write it in Perl. And she's like, I can't use Python. So At this point, I just wrote it for her in Perl. It took me 10 minutes. But it really highlighted the problem that we have where people seem to think that all the other languages are completely foreign and there's no way to cross over. So the solution I have is, what I've made is it's got a simple Mongo backend that all of the engines use. I have a simple single-page app in the front, and I have versions of this API engine in Ruby, Python, Perl, PHP, and Node. There's 2 Node ones because I like Happy and Express both. There are schema models. I'm going to talk about how to use schema models and what they can do for you in the repository. All of the things that you need are there. There's, in fact, a Docker container that you can pull, and it'll just do all the setup for you for all the languages, and you can just go. So I'll demonstrate how that works. Also, I wanted to say I like having conversations with my audience. I don't so much like lecturing to people. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand. I will do my best to see you despite the lights. So I'm really interested in wanting to know what it is that you guys find interesting or confusing, or what's sparking your thought processes. So if you want to play along, you can. What I've done is I created a fortune cookie server. So once upon a time in Unix, when you logged in, there was a message of the day, and then there was some pithy quote from some person, and that was what Unix did when you logged in. So I sort of made a fortune cookie server that you can edit, you can do all the CRUD operations on the quotes, and you can also get a random quote. It's pretty simple. So you can go to GitHub, Synedra, that's me. You can see that I've actually put it up there in the corner so that you all can tweet about me if you'd like to. On GitHub, it's Synedra Polyglot. On Docker, it's also Synedra Polyglot. And let me find for you the GitHub repository. There is a README that has all of the information that you need in order to get started, whether you're going to use Docker or, let's go back to there. Whether you're going to use Docker or if you're going to set it up yourself. But basically, if you follow the instructions here, you can run all of the engines, you can look at the code, you can see exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to go ahead and go through the code as well so that you guys have an idea of what you're looking at. But what I really wanted to do was create an apples-to-apples comparison between different languages, because what we tend to do is, oh yeah, I had it on let's try full screen. What we tend to do is we tend to have examples that are different in each of the languages. And so when you're trying to figure out how the languages map to each other, you're stuck with 2 completely different applications that work completely differently. So first I'm going to talk about schema models. How many of you are familiar with the idea of schema modeling for REST? Okay, just a few of you. Once upon a time, we had WSDL, and WSDL had, which was the SOAP contract. So when you tried to make a call to a SOAP API, you started out with the WSDL, and the WSDL was the contract that said, you can call these things, and this is what you'll get back. So it was pretty easy to make sure that, in fact, you were staying up with the API. And then we had REST APIs, and we were like, oh, this is awesome, because engineers will always make consistent, beautiful APIs that are greatly usable every time. Okay, so that's not what happened. So schema models are essentially a REST version of the WSDL file. It's not required. You don't even need to put it in your API, but if you have it, you have an artifact that you can look at. You can see how consistent you are between the different versions or different endpoints of your API. You can actually discuss it with your customers before you start coding. You can have a good idea of what it is that you're going to do, which does actually reduce, for engineers, the need to rewrite things, because it turns out that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So moving some of that design up front, which is one of the things that my book talks about, is very helpful. And so I've created RAML, which is MuleSoft supports it. It's one of the schema modeling standards. And then I used OpenAPI. If you guys are familiar with Swagger, it's changed its name to OpenAPI. There are other modeling languages, and I don't care if you write what your endpoints are going to do on a napkin. I just think you should spend some time ahead of time. So this demonstrates that. So we'll go ahead and look at, sorry, it signed me out. So this is for RAML. One of the advantages to the schema modeling languages is that you get some stuff for free. You get documentation for free. If you use OpenAPI, they actually will give you code stubs. There are many, many tools for all of the schema modeling languages. They're open source. They're really handy. And you can get, you can get for free this kind of documentation over here. So you can see I have an endpoint of quotes. And I can post or get it. When I get it, I'm going to get these things back. The way this works is that the schema model, if you look over here, and I make it a lot bigger, this is one of the things that you can just look at in GitHub as well. It tells you for each endpoint what the parameters are, what a successful call is going to look like. If it's a post or a put, what it is that you're supposed to send in. You can create a mock server with either Swagger or RAML. And RAML actually has some helper tools for editing, and you can see them down here. It'll tell you based on where you are exactly what it is that you can add. So this is, as I said, a map. It's a map of the entirety of the API, and it tells you exactly what do I send, what do I get back, what is it going to look like. It'll tell you things like, I want application JSON, or if they send in the wrong sort of things, the 400 will look like this. So this is the MuleSoft editor, and then I also have the Swagger editor with the same information. Swagger uses JSON or YAML, not markup, right? It does use markup also? You don't know. Okay. I'm just picking on my moderator. So again, you get this free documentation over here. This just happens when you're using Swagger. You can just run a doc server. It'll look at your schema model that you've created, and then it will create this documentation for you basically for free. So one of the things that you get from a schema model is you get documentation that you don't have to write. This is a fantastic thing. Developers are always happy with it. And as you can see, while the Swagger editor doesn't have the helpers, it actually it will generate clients in many different languages and servers in many different clients. And yes?
Is it possible to do this on your own workstation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Expose this to someone else?
Yep.
How did you bring down that feature to your own workstation?
It's open source. The Swagger editor itself is open source, so you just run it on your local system and play with it, and Bob's your uncle. People won't actually see this. It knows, because I've logged in, that this is the schema that I'm working with. But yeah, you can do this stuff locally. And in fact, you can also do the documentation and all of the other things locally as well. The schema modeling people are very much into making sure that things are reusable. All right, so that's the schema models. So the single page application, I'm not actually going to particularly go over it. It's a JavaScript application, and it does the CRUD operations, and it has that random. And I'm going to show you how the application works as we're going through the different languages. Okay, so let's start with Node.js. How many of you have made basic stuff in Node.js? Yeah, most of you. Yeah, Node's pretty handy, especially for creating servers. All of the libraries that I used for the languages, I picked very carefully. I actually did go ahead and use Express and Happy for Node because both of them work extremely well. And let me just show you the code. And then I'm going to go ahead and start the Docker container so you can see how this stuff is working. Yes?
What do you mean by very specific on the
I was trying to get the lowest overhead. So for Perl, I could have picked Catalyst or Dancer. I picked Dancer. For Ruby, I could have picked Rails or Sinatra. I picked Sinatra. For Python, I could have gone with Django, which is way overkill, but instead I went with Flask. So what I really tried to do was figure out what someone would do if they were trying to make a simple API in that language and nothing else. So as slim as possible. Slim is what is used in PHP. So it's as tidy as possible. And I tried to make the code as readable as possible. So once again, we're looking at JavaScript typed code, but you can see we have the namespaces API, and we're going to get quotes. It gives you the top. It gives you 10 of the quotes that are available. Quotes random gives you a random quote, but you can see that the code is designed to be portable. So if you want to make something in Haskell, rock on with your bad self. I'm actually going to work on a Go version as well, but I was dismayed to discover that the Go version that I was creating was not beautiful like the other ones that I created, and so it's going to have to wait just a little bit until I get to it. So let's go ahead and pull the Docker container. So I'm going to map port 3000 to port 3000 on the outside. With Docker, it normally keeps the ports hidden so that you can't actually access them from the system. So this is how I'm mapping it. And it automatically runs bash for me. OK, so now I am on the Docker container. Let's take a look at the instructions. Sorry, I know there's pauses, but I like to do actual live coding because all of you will probably figure it out if I were taping it. So as you can see, it tells you that, let's try to make that bigger because it's not actually, as you can see. Now you can see it. So it's got the endpoints API quotes random. The slash actually will tell you hello world from the framework, so you can make sure you're actually using Ruby and Sinatra and you're not accidentally running one of the node servers. And slash demo is the single page application. The setup actually tells you what you need to do for each of the different languages. But let's go down to Docker setup because I'm lazy. And I like things to set everything up for me. So if you look, for Perl, you would have to do a cpan command. And it does that for you in the Docker container. So all you have to do is Perl dancer server.pl. But if you get overexcited, what's going to happen is you're going to not notice that you have to run Mongo. I can't get that to work in Docker yet. And then we're going to grab those quotes. I created a file from a server that had quotes, and it creates 2,000 quotes. So you have to do those two things, and now you can go in and run any of the servers. So first of all, we're going to grab the IP. When we have the Docker for Macintosh and Docker for Windows, which are currently in beta, you're not going to have to do this magic with the IP address. It's done completely differently. But for now, when you use Docker machine on either Windows or Mac, you're going to end up with a separate IP than the IP that you have. And again, we're going to use the port 3000. So let's go with Node. All right. OK, so now it knows that we're from Express. This is good. That's what we told it to start. So we're in a good shape to start with. If I go to the endpoint that's API quotes, you can see it's just JSON that's coming through. But what I wanted people to be able to do was use an actual little application. So the application grabs the message of the day. That's a random. You can add a new quote. You can delete Gloria Steinem's quote if you want. And we'll add a new quote, which is, this is a quote from me. And so this is a quote from me, delete. You can view them, you can edit them. So you can do all of the things that you need to do in order to have a good API. So that's Node. And in fact, all of them work the same way. So I'm going to go into Perl. And this is all on the Docker container, so there's no reason you can't do it. So again, we can delete stuff, we can add things. All of these work exactly the same, and the backend is exactly the same. Notice that we didn't have the Gloria Steinem quote when we started up the Perl version. That's because we're accessing the same database. I wanted to make it so that all of the interfaces were exactly the same on the back end and the front end so that you could see exactly what was going on. So let's go back and look at a little bit of the code again. Does anybody have any questions so far on this? You're all going to be nice to each other now, right? No more bagging on other people's languages. Davey, my coworker, said, if you can't come up with 3 things to dislike about your own language, then you're not doing it right. So maybe we could all go around and say, yeah, I use Perl, it has these 3 problems. And then they can say, yeah, well, I use Ruby and it has these 3 problems. Would be a much better conversation than I hate your language because it has @ signs, which is I've heard people say who are Pythonistas. They like English. It's good. So the happy server, you can see that it's slightly different. The way it does the methods, it's a get and there's the endpoint. You can see also that the code looks pretty much the same. And once again, code on a slide, hard to understand. You're not going to get a lot out of it except kind of what I'm pointing out. But remember, you can grab all this stuff from GitHub and play with it. And I encourage you strongly to do that. OK, that's good. So here's Perl. And I really want to show you my Perl code because I am so used to people reminding me that Perl is considered to be ugly. But it doesn't have to be. It gives you the opportunity to make ugly code that's one line, that's obfuscated. But if you look at this, you can see what's happening. You could port this to another language. Perl is not scary. Just because the sample code is only available in Perl doesn't mean that you can't figure it out and make it work in the language that you have. A side note, the most difficult thing I had to do in almost every language was send out the index.html file as a static thing. Most of the API frameworks like you to do dynamic for everything, and I'm like, no, there's just this one file. It just this one file. And in a lot of cases, it actually took me longer to write the code for the API than it did for me to figure out how to serve that up gracefully. So that was one of the things I discovered. I also discovered when you're trying to keep things in sync between 5 different languages, you fix something for one of them and you have to fix it in all the other 4. There is technical debt involved. And there's things like, well, I wrote 3 languages before I wrote Ruby, and then I discovered that Ruby has this thing where it uses ID, and it uses the Mongo ID. And I really, really didn't want my REST API endpoints to be like /API/quotes/ horrible looking Mongo string. I wanted it to be like 1 or 2 or 3. And so I overrode ID in the other languages, but Ruby wasn't down with that, so I had to use the index instead. So I've learned a lot of lessons in doing this. Let's take a look at Python. So once again, we have the class quote resource is an object, and it knows that it's API quotes, and it shows you exactly what it's going to do. It's going to go to Mongo. It's going to the random one is going to grab a random quote from the server, and you can go ahead and delete and update things using the index. So here's the quote list, which is so the quote is API. Let's see if I have it. Yeah, here it is. So quote is API quotes quote ID. So that's where you're going to do the put. It's where you're going to do a delete. You can go ahead and do a get on it. API quotes, you're going to do a get to get a list of the quotes. You're going to go ahead and do a post to create a new item. And I do not support delete because I would rather that my quotes not go away whole cloth. So if you're not familiar with get, post, and delete and how they're generally used in APIs, this is another way that you can learn things from this code. It's very simple. It shows you what it's going to do. And the schema model actually demonstrates this as well. So this is another way for you to explore. All right. I wish it would just remember that I want it to be in full screen. So PHP, we're using Slim. It's very similar. We've actually ended up struggling a little bit with a few of the returns and how JavaScript processes them. I've learned a lot about single-page applications. We had a couple of situations with PHP where it wasn't working exactly like everyone else, and so I had to edit them.
Don't bag on PHP.
I'm not bagging on it. I happened to have Davey Shafiq on my team, who is one of the main guys working on. He's a guy that's working on PHP 7, and he's quite skilled with PHP. But in this case, we had a couple of errors that we had to fix. So Python, again, we looked at that one, and then Ruby. Is it going to sound like bagging on Ruby to say that it's really cute? I mean, I feel like it's kind of the Furby of languages. I love Ruby. I really do. I mean, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy when I write things in it. But mostly I write mostly I write my sample code in Python. And the reason I do that is because if you don't know Python, Python is the easiest language to understand because there's not any decorators and it looks kind of like English and it's got to be spaced out so that you can see things. And people tend to use pretty good names for their variables. And it reads kind of like a conversation, which is odd because Perl was written by a linguist and Python was written by a mathematician. But, you know, what can you do? So the Ruby version is really easy to read. If you aren't excited about looking at Python and porting that, the Ruby version, especially Sinatra, lends itself quite well to creating APIs. Okay, so I can talk about more stuff, but I would like to get you guys some questions, ideas, feedback. I love this talk. I love to give it, and I really, really want people to pull down that GitHub repository and dig into it. I can't dig into it too deeply with slides. It will just be frustrating for you guys. Why is it not loving me anymore? Well.
Can we get the address again?
Yeah, my handle is Synedra, Synedra, and then it's the polyglot repository. Here, I'll bring that one up. And the Docker container is Synedra polyglot, and I strongly recommend that you use the instructions that are in the GitHub repository to know how to start Mongo up and load the JSON stuff into the database so that you have it. And if you delete a bunch of stuff out of the repository or out of the quotes and then decide that you want to start again, it's really simple to do. So especially if you're using Docker, you can just kill that container and start a new one. There may well be bugs. I would love it if you would provide me with bugs that you find. I tried to test each and every single language with each and every single process, but as soon as I change it for one of the languages, then I have to check all of the other languages, and one can get confused when one is looking at 6 different engines. Any questions?
Can you say something about how you set up the Docker?
Oh, sure. I love talking about Docker. So let's take a look again at what it is that we need to set up, right? So we have to import the collection in for PHP. We're going to have to do these steps in order to get it to run. Python is the same, Node, and Ruby. So there's setup steps for each of the engines. They're not difficult. They're copy and paste. It's very simple. But the Docker setup, it goes ahead and it does that setup.py. It does the gem bundle install. It does all of the pieces. And the way it does that, and this is not the way a lot of people use Docker, but I have to give workshops a lot to our customers to teach them how to use our APIs. And I have a Docker container for that because Python 2.7.3 doesn't work correctly on Windows, and it's very challenging to get a Windows box working correctly with the code quickly, and I don't want to get bogged down in setup. So the more mature that Docker becomes, the better it is for my customers because we can just get started. They've got everything going. So I'm using the Python 2.7.10 image because that's the only way to get Python 2.7.10 on Docker. It is based on Debian. So you can see, do exactly what you would do if you started up a DigitalOcean droplet, right? So you're going to apt-get update. You're going to go ahead and apt-get install a bunch of things. That gives me almost everything that I need. I have to pull Node. And then I'm doing exactly the same things I'm doing elsewhere, the things that I told you to do for setup. And when it gets to the end, it just goes into the data directory. I can't get Mongo to run as part of the container startup. And so you have to do those two pieces separately. But this is tied into Docker Hub. And so what I did was I actually said every time something changes in the GitHub repository that is polyglot, go ahead and rebuild the Docker container for me, which it is currently doing. Perhaps it's done. It would be great. I added a message of the day to make it easier for people to be able to use the Docker container. Any other questions? Yes?
You said you wanted to get prettier URLs, so yeah, one instead of the big blog.
Right.
And could you expound more a little bit on how you did that?
So instead of using using the ID item, I created a new one called index. An index basically just says find the largest index and then make this new one the next version. This is all done on the Mongo side. So as far as PHP knows, all it needs to do is it needs to pull the index, the author, and the content. Those are the three pieces of information for a quote.
Why was it harder? Or was it, maybe it wasn't PHP that was harder?
Ruby.
Ruby. Why was it harder?
Well, I was just using ID and overwriting it because OID is actually what Mongo uses. But Ruby is certain. It's very helpful. It knows that what you really want is for the ID to be that Mongo ID. And there is no way to overwrite it. So I had to use index instead. Yes?
As someone who appears to be very multilingual,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any tips for people on how to kind of expand their language range without sacrificing their core language or languages?
Well, I actually think that Code Academy is a fantastic way to get enough basis in a language to feel comfortable starting out working with it. I'm always excited. I just saw that there's a Ruby, a Head First Ruby book that O'Reilly wrote. I love their Head First books because they teach you the why of the language, and that's one of the best ways to make sure that you do have idiomatic code that looks like other people's code. And that's one of the big differences is how you declare those variables and where, whether you're exposing accessors in Ruby. So it's just a bunch of different ways to do the same sort of thing. So that's what I do. I went to Code Academy, and then I wrote some code, and I went to James Higginbotham, who is a super Ruby guy, and I'm like, he said, that looks as good as most Ruby programmers that I've worked with. I'm like, okay, good. Is it recognizable as Ruby? Is there something that really annoys you about it? No. So the more sample code you look at, also, the better off you're going to be.
Was that a code for comparing
Yeah, Rosetta Code is cool. It's a little complicated, right? The thing that I did here is pretty simple. Rosetta Code is a really cool project where there's tasks that you need to do, and they're usually algorithmic tasks, and then you demonstrate how to do it in the various languages. And so they have, I don't know, 30 languages or something. Hundreds of languages and tons of different tasks. So it's kind of fun to use, but again, I was trying really hard to create a thing, an actual application sort of thing that you could expand on and make it work the way you wanted it to. You can put your recipes in there, you can put whatever you want in there. Quotes are just simple because it makes the code easier to read, and then you can extend it to be awesome. Yes?
So do you try to make a code fit the idiomatic pattern?
I do, and I work with the people in the language. So with Perl, I'm pretty comfortable with it. With Python, I'm pretty comfortable. With Ruby, I did check with a friend of mine who's a super senior Ruby dev. And with PHP, I worked with my coworker who is a major PHP guy. So I wrote what I believe to be idiomatic code, but I double checked it. And it turns out to be right, so. So I've worked enough with all the languages. I am making our sample code in all of the different languages, so it's kind of a fun exercise, but it's also kind of weird. It's like I have a BA in philosophy, and whenever I would read like Plato, my brain would go into this other mode, and then my break would be over, and I have to close the book, and then my brain would snap back into the real world, and it's kind of how I feel when I go between languages. Is I've put on a different hat. But just like when you're translating actual spoken languages, when you're translating languages in code, one of the things that you'll realize is that eventually you're not translating it anymore. You're just writing it in that language. Even if you don't have as many levels in that language as you do in the original language, you're no longer trying to take idiomatic stuff that looks like this and bring it over here. Now you can start again. And that works out really well. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have any like style guide checkers for languages?
I do not. Instead I have the schema model, which is it's more important to me that people understand the endpoint. But I will probably start running them through JSLint and things like that. Make sure that my coding is as complete and clear as possible. So we had a question back there. Yes.
If you're working in a truly polyglot, what do you do in terms of naming convention differences, like when you're exchanging JSON?
I just generally try to work with something that looks appropriate for the language.
But if you're in true polyglot, you guys developers speak different languages.
I remember that I'm providing sample code for people.
Yeah.
And so I try to make sure that I present it in a way that looks correct for that language, even though it means that I have to do a little bit of extra work in order to get the object model and everything working correctly.
But if a group is working in different languages,
I have not ever seen that. I have not ever seen that. I'm sure it might happen, but I have not. I mean, either people, the group is Java or the group is Perl, and there might be a little bit of Python, but I think style guides for each of the languages is a great idea, and I would extend it to this as well. If you have a group that is working on multiple languages, then not allowing it to be implicit that everyone's going to get it perfectly right, because once again, we're talking about schema models in REST, right? The engineers all got everything perfect, and that's why we're now modeling our schemas. So the same thing, style guides are a good idea. Yes?
Is there anything that helps you test the API?
Currently not. I actually am going to start I'm going to write a Jenkins test suite that goes through all the read and write and everything, and make sure everything is completely consistent between the languages. And I will tell you right now that it's not 100% consistent at this point, but it does work, and I'm working on making it tidier and neater. So again, pull requests, issues, patches welcome, and all like that. So I think maybe one more question, if I have one. Okay, well, I'm Sinedra, again, on Twitter, on GitHub, pretty much everywhere that you might look for me, on Gmail. And I'm happy to talk to anyone who has ideas. If you want to contribute another language, that would be fantastic. Like I said, I'm working on Go next. But I hope this was useful, and look me up if you have questions about it. Thanks very much.